Good evening, and welcome to the third annual Dr. Kenneth E. Robinson Cyril Packwood Memorial Lecture, sponsored by the Department of Community and Cultural Affairs. I'd like to welcome to the stage the Honorable Dale D. Butler, JPMP, Minister of Culture and Social Rehabilitation, for welcoming remarks.
Minister Lister, fellow parliamentary colleagues, members of parliament and the opposition, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, and especially a warm welcome to Mrs. Robinson, who is sitting in the front, and her family, and Mrs. Packwood, who I greeted, and her family, who were just sitting there in the middle. And we're very fortunate to have both of you. I'd like to recognize you for everything that you have done, and Mrs. Packwood, you have done in the community. Thank you all for being here tonight. Tonight's event is very, very special because this is the third annual Dr. Kenneth E. Robinson Cyril Packwood Memorial Lecture. And this program was organized as a way of recognizing the contributions of these two significant Bermudian historians. We have invited members of both families to share a short biography so that this memorial lecture lives up to its intention to keep the memory of Dr. Robinson and Mr. Packwood alive. This year, we honor these two trailblazing Bermudian historians by sponsoring a documentary screening and talk by our eminent guest scholar and filmmaker, Dr. Sheila S. Walker. We are very pleased to welcome Dr. Walker, who was kind enough to visit us and offer a lecture on this occasion. History shows us that we are all connected, and these connections are particularly evident when we look at the diaspora and see the ways that our history of migration and forced displacement has resulted in communities with African retentions in every corner of the globe. The screening of tonight's film, Scattered Africa, Faces and Voices of the African Diaspora, will undoubtedly educate us further. I would like to thank the members of the Historical Heartbeats Committee as well as the Emancipation Committee, both of which fall under the Department of Community and Cultural Affairs, for jointly assisting the organization of this program. And we appreciate their assistance, and we look forward to an enjoyable and educational evening. Thank you.
I'd like to welcome to the stage Mr. Kabir Cyril Gadio, who is the grandson of Cyril Packwood, and he will speak about his grandfather. Thank you.
I am Kabir Cyril Gadio. My grandfather was Cyril Outerbridge Packwood. He was born in Bermuda on November 22nd, 1930, to Cyril and Gladys Packwood. My great-grandfather, Cyril Sr., loved to tell the story of how his son was the first successful cesarean birth in Bermuda. I guess for someone who would have such a remarkable life and offer so much that was remarkable, it really was only fitting that he have such a remarkable start to his life. My grandfather grew up as an only child in Wellington, St. George's, and attended East End Primary, Temperance Hall, and Berkeley Institute. He left Bermuda at the age of 15 to finish high school in the United States. He earned his bachelor's in history from Fisk University in Nashville, Tennessee in 1953, and a master's of science degree in library science from Western Reserve University in Cleveland, Ohio in 1954. He later received a second master's degree in history from City University of New York in 1972. My grandfather first went off to school. When my grandfather first went off to school, he was going to study chemistry and become a dentist. At Fisk, he met and was mentored by Anna Bontemps, the famous writer and historian from the Harlem Renaissance, and also chief librarian at Fisk University Library. That relationship would shape the course of his life, a life which would end up giving so much back to the community from which he came. He worked for the New York Public Library from 1957 to 1968, where he was the head librarian at County Cullen Library in Harlem, and then at the Borough of Manhattan Community College Library, where he was the chief librarian. He had always wanted to return to Bermuda to work and live, but the opportunities did not exist in Bermuda during this time of segregation. When the position of chief librarian of Bermuda Public Libraries opened up in 1985, he came home. He remained at the Bermuda Public Library until his retirement in 1993. My grandfather wrote 2 books on Bermuda history and numerous articles which were published. Chained on the Rock was the first, published in 1975, and to this day is known as the foremost treatise on slavery in Bermuda. He also published in 1977 Detour Bermuda, Destination U.S., House of Representatives, The Life of Joseph Rainey. He had many different interests. He fell in love with the African continent on his first trip to the continent in 1974. He ended up returning every year, sometimes 2 and 3 times a year, for the rest of his life. He came often to visit my brothers and me. He loved plants and gardening. He was a railroad expert and collected just about everything on railroads. He also loved boats and served on the Bermuda Government Committee for Marine and Ports. He was a Rotarian. He worked with the Bermuda Aquarium and Zoological Society, was a docent at the National Art Gallery. He was a trustee at the Bermuda Maritime Museum and Dockyard. My grandfather died in 1998 after a brief illness, but not without having loved my beautiful grandmother, Dorothy Isabel Packwood, and having held and nurtured me and my 2 brothers, Hamdi and Haruna. My mother, Cheryl Packwood, was the only child of Cyril and Dorothy Packwood. My grandfather had a smile and a kind word for everyone. He lived a full and wonderful life and loved the people he met during his life. I miss him very much, but his spirit lives on in all of us.
I am certain your grandfather would have been very proud to see such a fine young man. Well done, well done. Part of the reason why we ask the families of Cyril Packwood and Dr. Kenneth E. Robinson to read these biographies is because, in addition to making sure that this doesn't become a memorial lecture in name only, we want to make sure that the people who attend this lecture are fully aware of the importance of these individuals, not only as historians, but as human beings. I would like to welcome to the stage Mrs. Shirley Pearman, the daughter of Dr. Kenneth E. Robinson.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Protocol has been established, and it's something to follow this young man, but our hearts are in the same places. Just as an aside, I can share with you that my mother taught Mr. Packwood at Temperance Hall. I'm sure his family knows this, but there will be members of the audience who are not aware of that. And he was very fond of her as one of his teachers. This is the 3rd annual Packwood Robinson Memorial Lecture hosted by the Department of Community and Cultural Affairs, and I commend them for continuing the series. In this way, new and younger audiences are introduced to these Bermudian scholars and their works. My father was born in 1911, and as I've mentioned, his wife and my mother is here. Time will eventually reduce my father's life to dates, places, and data. In the meantime, while I am in a position to do so, I'll take the liberty of enlightening you on an aspect of Kenneth E. Robinson, the man. July 12, 1975, I accompanied my father to the Berkeley Institute graduation ball. In his address to the graduates, he made them mindful of their history and offered them a challenge, a combination which is classic Kenneth E. Robinson. 1997 would be the centenary of their alma mater. During the intervening years, he suggested that, and I quote, "Each of you will, in all probability, make a momentous decision in your personal affairs and in the affairs of this country." His speech continues, "That is to say, it is probable that during that period of time, you will decide to link your personal destiny with the destiny of this country, or you will decide to abandon this, your native land. To put it another way, either you will choose to devote your brain power, your natural and your cultivated capabilities, your expertise, your enterprise and your visions and dreams to the enhancement of life and living in Bermuda. Or you will choose to leave us for the benefit of some other man's nation. To those of you who will prove unabashedly chauvinistic, as I boast that I am, I urge you to take courage, for if enough of us keep the faith, we can achieve a magnificent nationhood. As I see it, Berkeleyites can draw on a splendid heritage, and prospects for the immediate future are literally fantastic. However, I doubt that we can afford the amount of brain drain of Berkeleyites and other Bermudians which we have suffered during the past 75 years if we are to persevere and enhance our own legacies. The superlative contributions of those who have periodically rejoined us after long careers abroad are most encouraging, and others are to be avidly looked for. But it is imperative at this time that such losses shall be substantially diminished. Obviously, the decision to participate or not to participate in the shaping of Bermuda's future destiny is for you individually to make. Certainly, my decision was my own, and yours must be your own. My participation in the cultivation of Bermudian pastures has extended over 40 years, and I wish I had another 40 to give. I hope that many of you will prove to be thoroughly chauvinistic, that is to say, aggressively pro-Bermudian. Thank you, Kenneth E. Robinson. My father passed away 3 years later, after this speech was delivered, in 1978. Interestingly, Cyril Packwood, who was younger than my father, but a respected colleague, did return to Bermuda, as you've heard from his grandson, where he helped to enhance our lives. Thank you for allowing me to personalize my father, and do enjoy the film. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Pearman. We appreciate that. The happy task of introducing our guest lecturer falls to me. Dr. Sheila S. Walker, PhD, cultural anthropologist and filmmaker, is executive director of African Diaspora Incorporated, a nonprofit organization that is developing a documentary series and educational materials about the global African diaspora. She has done extensive field work, lectured, consulted, and participated in cultural events in much of Africa and the African diaspora. Based on these experiences, she organized an international conference on the African diaspora and the modern world, and edited the volume African Roots, American Cultures, Africa in the Creation of the Americas, and produced the documentary that we will see tonight, Scattered Africa, Faces and Voices of the African Diaspora. A member of the International Scientific and Technical Committee of the UNESCO Slave Route Project, she recently produced the documentary Slave Routes, A Global Vision for the project. Dr. Walker was director of the Center for African and African Studies, the Annabelle Irion Worsham Centennial Professor in the College of Liberal Arts, and a professor of anthropology at the University of Texas at Austin. She was the William and Camille Cosby Professor in the Humanities and Social Sciences, Professor of Anthropology, and Director of the African Diaspora and the World Program at Spelman College. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Sheila S. Walker.
Good evening, everyone. I'm really happy to be back in Bermuda. I was here a few years ago for the African Diaspora Heritage Trail Conference, and I was here for the previous ones. I wasn't here for the most recent one. But what really impressed me was how much emphasis Bermuda began to put on its African diaspora and heritage. I was very impressed by the difference between the first conference, and I don't remember what years these were, and the next to the last one. I was impressed by the difference in the original brochure and the subsequent one. It was obvious that research was done and that more interest was being taken in Bermuda's African heritage and connections to the rest of the African diaspora. And I think that's wonderful, and if the African Diaspora Heritage Trail only did that, that in itself is great. This film is the result of an annoyance of mine. Don't get mad, get even. The former director of the UNESCO Slave Route Project asked me, he was creating the International Scientific and Technical Committee, and he asked me who should be on the committee. And I said, well, why don't you do something revolutionary? Why don't you, instead of inviting the same people one always sees at such events, why don't you do something different by inviting those invisibilized members of the African diaspora? And I named names and I named organizations from various places in the Americas. I said, well, why don't you instead of inviting the anthropologist from Colombia, who has made a reputation writing about Afro-Colombians but not opened any doors for them, why not invite the director of the major organization? Ditto for Uruguay, ditto for Argentina. And this man said to me, and for his own, he was a functionary of UNESCO, and so he had to think about how things work there. He said, no, we need high-level people. Well, I didn't think that was okay. So I met someone else in UNESCO who helped me get some money from UNESCO, and I organized a conference to which I invited some of the people who are not of high enough level to represent themselves. I think people should be able to represent themselves. Who can tell your story better than you can? So my conference, I had major scholars, as you'll see, and I also invited people who are not scholars in the sense of having advanced degrees, and are not scholars in the sense of getting research grants and doing research based on foundation funding. These are people who live lives and who have not necessarily had the privilege of getting an advanced degree. For example, you will see Tomás Oliveira Chirimini from Uruguay. You may not know that there are Afro-Uruguayans. If you go to Encyclopedia, it will assure you that he doesn't exist. So you may want to say that you saw a science fiction film tonight with people who don't exist. But when I called him to ask him to come and talk in this conference at the University of Texas, he said, oh, I'd love to come, but how can I come and speak at a university when I didn't have the privilege of attending a university? And I said, well, you have a choice. You can either come and talk about your own experiences, or you can tell me who the anthropologist is to whom you told your stories and who's written a book based on what you told him, and I'll invite that person. Would you prefer that? He said, I'll come. And so I think that you will find that these folks are perfectly capable of representing themselves. And based on this conference, I also did an edited book that's called African Roots, American Cultures, Africa, and the Creation of the Americas. But of course, nobody reads. And so I thought it was also good to show you these folks. And so what you will see is the result of these efforts. And periodically I think, oh, this film is old, this is out of date. And then I think about it, and I think everybody seems pretty surprised to see it and thinks it's totally novel. So I'm looking forward to your reactions and suggestions, and I hope also to be able to come back to Bermuda and film something here too. Thank you. Doing what academics call petit marronnage. You know, you escape from the plantation a little bit and then you come back. Now I'm doing grand marronnage. I've totally escaped. And I don't work at a university anymore. I decided that it was limiting. And now I'm making documentaries because I want to teach on a larger scale. You know, when you talk to a class, you talk to 30 kids and half of them don't really want to be there. And I also noticed that when I tried to explain to them, you know, I'd go someplace they'd never heard of, and I'd come back totally enthusiastic about seeing the African diaspora in Abu Dhabi, in the United Arab Emirates, in the Persian Gulf, or in Huehuetan on the Costa Chica of Mexico. And I'd be real enthusiastic, and I'd try to explain very well, and they'd look at me like, what's she talking about? So this being, you know, 2008, I figured what I need to do is just be able to slide a DVD into the machine, push a button, and say, this is where I was, see? And then they see it, they get it. You know, they say, oh, that looks like my cousin. You know, where is that? How'd they get there? So, I don't know that I'm going to do a conference, but I do things. You know, you have to do things. I can't see all the hands very well, so, okay, over there.
Is this likely to happen in England, one of these programs, please?
Say it again?
Is this program likely to happen in England?
Which program?
Well, you know.
Will I show the film?
Yeah.
If somebody invites me, absolutely. I go any place. And every place I go is an opportunity to learn more about the African diaspora, because we are global. Yeah. This is really important for us to know. I see a hand there. Yeah.
I've been doing some quiet research myself on the diaspora to Sri Lanka, Malaysia, the Andaman Islands, India, the south of India, north of India. I was in Argentina 2 years ago looking for, well, my objective wasn't to look for the black population, but while I was there, I was very curious about where they were, because they had to be there. And I just saw the odd person here and there. And then one day, it was like the first day of spring, and you know, everybody goes outside, and the whole city seems to empty out into the parks and along the waterways. And there I saw a fairly sizable group of people of African descent. And it was quite fascinating because there's lots of dancing going on. And I was studying Spanish at the time, so I was understanding a bit of what was being said. And there was a master of ceremonies that had set himself up a European Argentinian. And he was making reference to one of the dancers there, black dancer, and he was calling him by a name that was, I guess, in Argentina they try to pretend they don't have a black population, right? And the man had made some reference, some kind of fake sort of reference to a person, and he says, "I am not that, I am black," in Spanish, of course. And that was rather interesting to me. And I also saw in my travels out in Argentina, in Buenos Aires, in search of more black people, where do they live and so on, I came across a huge mural on a wall in a rather run-down neighborhood near San Telmo. And it was really trying to tell, I thought, the history of blacks in Argentina, pictorial. And I became very excited about that, but I didn't know who to talk to. So I went to the libraries. I found only 2 books. One was, that was in English. One had a very general history, which was quite good, of Argentina, and it sort of suggested something about the black population, but it didn't go into detail. And just before I was leaving at the airport, I found the book. It was called The Myth of Argentine's History. And there's a professor at some university there who has written this book recently that tells more about the black population and what happened to them. They were largely killed off. That's why there are so few left.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you. What a great compliment to what you saw. Lucia Molina, whom you saw, who said we don't exist, people always ask her, "Oh, are you Brazilian?" No. Well, were your parents Brazilian? No. Your grandparents? No. At the beginning of the 19th century, more than a third of the population of Buenos Aires was of African origin. Beginning of the 19th century. There's a wonderful book in English called The Afro-Argentines of Buenos Aires, 1800 to 1900 by George Reed Andrews. And he was intrigued by exactly how all these people disappeared. You know, Argentina has sort of a reputation for disappearing people. And so the first people they disappeared were the African descendants. And so he spent a lot of time in the archives trying to figure out what happened to them. And they were indeed killed off in various kinds of ways. Men were freed from slavery to be in the army, because Buenos Aires had a lot of wars. Argentina had a lot of wars, and so they were the cannon fodder on the front lines. So if they were to survive, their military service, then they'd be free. They had to survive for 5 years, though. And I can imagine that some of the wars in the Southern Cone, there was the War of the Triple Alliance between Brazil, Uruguay, and Argentina ganged up on Paraguay. And I imagine that war probably looked like Nigeria versus Benin versus Togo versus Burkina Faso, with all the African descendants on the front lines. So that's one theory. One theory is that, another part of the explanation is there was a yellow fever epidemic. And another one was, the major real explanation is that Argentina, there was the generation of the 1880s, and Argentina decided that it wanted to be a white modern country, like the United States. And in order to be a white modern country, they needed some white people. And so they invited Europeans to come and just be white, bring them some white genes. So obviously they were not white enough. And so a whole lot of Southern Europeans came to Argentina, and they were given all kinds of facilities for settling, but they essentially demographically drowned the African descendant population. Plus, one of the explanations is that most of those people were men, and given the deaths of Afro-Argentinian men in the wars, that the Afro-Argentinian women and these European men made lighter and lighter children. Additionally, black people identified as black were just written out of history. A new word was created, trigueño. Trigueño means wheat-colored. And so people who had been black when they were poor, once they got a little education and some money, were no longer black, and they were then defined as trigueño. So there were no more black people in the census. So they both were indeed killed, or died, but they were also just redefined. And so they were still there, but they were defined as no longer there. So that's pretty strange. And the other issue, the African diaspora in Asia. In the film, I mentioned that Joseph Harris had done a book called The African Presence in Asia. And he's a wonderful person. He's done a lot of very significant research, and his maps are the maps on the African diaspora. In the States, there's a Rand McNally, there are these huge wall maps, and in the map rack that one finds in universities, his maps of the diaspora are part of the map rack. And I've told him that he makes me tired. He's an historian, so he can go to archives. I'm an anthropologist. You know, I have to go to people's houses, I have to go to the villages and hang out. And until January of '06, I couldn't talk about the African diaspora in Asia because I hadn't been there. I'd read stuff, but I hadn't been there. And in January '06, there was a conference in Goa on Afro-Indians. And it was a wonderful conference in that it was both a conference about Afro-Indians and directly following the conference, there was a workshop for Afro-Indians. And the workshop allowed the three significant populations of African descendants in India to get together for the first time in history and to get to know each other. There are three major communities that live in three separate states. And, you know, India's a little huge and has all those 16 national languages, and each of these groups speaks a different language that's written in a different script. And they have different histories, but there is a group in the city of Hyderabad, capital of Andhra Pradesh. There's a group in the forest of Karnataka, and there's a group in Gujarat in the north that has also migrated to Mumbai. So I only got to visit two of the three groups, didn't get to visit all three, but there they are. And interestingly enough, those in Gujarat have a song in which the refrain is, and these are not the Dravidians in the south, the very dark people who are evidence of the traveling of the Y chromosome out of Africa to populate the world. These people define themselves as having kingri hair. Kingri. Now, when I heard that word, it seemed a little familiar. And I asked a presumed linguist what Bantu origin that word had, and he assured me that it did not have any Bantu origin. Now, how much sense does that make? You know? I then asked a Bantu speaker who, I have to say something about that, about this particular Bantu speaker later, because it's a specifically Bermuda reference. He said he didn't speak deep enough, a deep enough version of his language, but he asked his mother, and his mother said Kingla refers to hair that when you comb it, you know, it. You got it. So I was impressed by how African culture had gone across both oceans, and that you could find similar cultural phenomena on both sides of Africa. The instrument that's played in Brazil, the birimbau, it's a one-string harp. It's played in Gujarat also. It's called malanga there. So they've kept, malunga. So they've kept a Bantu name for it. And so that's a whole fascinating part of the African diaspora. And now those folks are becoming conscious parts of the diaspora also, especially in India, thanks to this conference. Yeah. Yes. Huh? Okay, yes, so this person, Edmond Mukala, who works at UNESCO and who was at the two previous ADHT conferences, not this last one. At the first one, in the same building, on that terrace upstairs, there was a reception, and some Gumbes danced. And I saw him standing and staring at them with a real strange look on his face. And I turned around and was talking to somebody else, and when I looked back, he was dancing with the Gumbes. Then he came over to me and he said, "This is amazing. You haven't forgotten." I said, "We haven't forgotten what?" He said, "African culture." He when he saw those gumbes, first of all, he recognized the rhythm, he recognized the steps, and when he went, he could dance perfectly with them. He understood the commands, and he asked them, well, how did you learn this? Do you have a documentary about the Congo? Did you study? How did you learn this? And they said, huh, Congo? So he was just blown away by, he said, we did that exact dance to that exact rhythm every day after school in Congo, in Brazzaville, capital of the Congo, one of the two Congos. The second year, so this is the previous ADHD conference, that we saw more than one group of gumbes. And I asked him, well, did you dance with those? And he said, oh no, I wouldn't dance with them. And I said, why wouldn't you dance with them? He said, no, I would dance with them. Why?